Egyptian's silver cup had been found in Benjamin's bag. And Benjamin was to remain as a slave in Egypt. And his brothers, all of Benjamin's brothers, returned to Egypt, returned to the city quickly. Judah gave his impassioned plea, which showed love and compassion for his father and brothers. He offered himself as a substitute to stand in the place of Joseph, or of Benjamin. His love, his compassion permeated all of Judah's speech. The family had changed. At this point, the Egyptian could not contain himself anymore and told all of his servants, "Leave me with these men. Leave us alone." Remember, up to this point, Joseph had always spoken through an interpreter. He didn't speak Hebrew to his brothers. He spoke through an interpreter. So they had no idea that he could speak their language. Nobody was in the room except for this powerful Egyptian and the 11 brothers. And the Egyptian started weeping loudly. This weeping was 22 years in the making. He had been through a lot. Sold by his brothers into slavery, sold into Potiphar's house, accused of something he didn't do, sent to prison, and then exalted. His journey had been incredible. There was a lot of emotion that Joseph was feeling at this point. So loud was he weeping, in fact, that the Egyptians outside heard him. Those in Pharaoh's house heard him weeping, which shows two things. One, he was weeping loudly, and two, his house was fairly close to Pharaoh's, which shows, again, his exalted status. The Egyptian, who, again, had always spoken through an interpreter, suddenly spoke in Hebrew to the brothers. "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" The brothers stood in terror, silently unable to speak. The word that the ESV uses is dismayed, and the word means terror. It means a panic that seizes a person when surprised by an impending doom. So this would be like somebody walking into a cave and seeing a bear. There's an impending doom. Something bad is going to happen. They were terrified. I mean, they were fearful when Joseph set them in birth order at the table. There was something else that he knew. But they were now bewildered. They were confused. They were shocked. And they were terrified. Imagine this powerful Egyptian who had put them through so much suddenly speaks their language and says, "I am Joseph." I mean, how could this be Joseph? They thought he was dead. I mean, Judah had just said, "Our brother is dead." How could this be him? This dead person now claims to be the Egyptian standing before them. This is a theme that we see throughout the entire Old Testament. It's the theme of resurrection. Those who are dead are now alive. We saw this with Abraham and Isaac. When Abraham went to sacrifice Isaac on Mount Moriah, Abraham said to his servants, "Isaac and I will come back. We will return." The theme of resurrection is over and over again. Remember the road to Emmaus. Jesus said that the entire Old Testament was about him. All that he suffered, his death, burial, and resurrection are seen in the Old Testament, and this is one of the ways, the theme of resurrection. Here, the brothers thought Joseph was dead, and now he was alive. This is another way Joseph shows us the 3:15 Redeemer. The brothers stood in disbelief, verse 4 and 5. So Joseph said to his brothers, "Come near to me, please." And they came near. And he said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt, and now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves, because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life." Joseph understood that they didn't believe him. They were bewildered. And so he said, "Come near to me." Was this really Joseph? They didn't know what to make of the claim. If it was Joseph, what would he do? Like, there's all kinds of things going through their minds at this point. And so to prove his identification, to prove that he was Joseph, he told them something that they did that only Joseph would have known. They sold him into slavery. Remember, I'm your brother, the one that you sold into slavery. You sent me here. I'm him. But then he was a man of power and authority. The roles had totally reversed. The last time they were together, Joseph was the helpless one, and they were in authority, and they sold him. The roles are reversed. What would he do? It's a scary place to be. But Joseph didn't allow his brothers to sit in anguish, wondering what he would do to them. He immediately tried to put them at ease. Yes, they had sold him, but it was God who brought him to Egypt. Yes, you sold me, but don't be too hard on yourselves, because it was actually God who brought me here. There's 2 years of famine and 5 to come. Joseph was in Egypt to save their lives. What they meant for evil, God used to save their very lives. God brought him to Egypt. God put him in a position of power so that he could be used to save them. It's an amazing thing, isn't it? That God uses those very horrible things that we do for his purpose and his kingdom. Joseph was sent to Egypt not to save the entire world, but to save the covenant family, to save his brothers, to save a remnant. This needed to happen because he needed to preserve the lives of the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Because if he didn't, the promises to them would not come true. And so God used this very thing to not just save this family, but to fulfill his promise. Now, you should feel this theological tension in this passage. It is a very real tension. The brothers freely sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites. The Ishmaelites freely sold Joseph to Potiphar. But it was God who brought him to Egypt. See this tension between God's sovereignty and human free will? We live in a proximate cause world. This causes that. God does not live in the same world. God is not bound by time, place, events. He exists outside of space and time. And so he does not operate in this causes that. It's something that we cannot fathom. Because his sovereignty and human free will we see as worlds colliding. How do these things work out? One time, Charles Spurgeon, who fully believed in God's sovereignty, was asked, how do you reconcile God's sovereignty and human free will? And he said, you don't have to reconcile friends. They work together. How this works, we don't know. There is much debate in our age. Are you a Calvinist or are you an Arminian? Do you believe in God's sovereignty, or do you believe in human free will? As if these are two completely different things, and these are fun debates if they are done respectfully and done well. But the problem is each side greatly simplifies a very difficult, complex topic that we can't understand. There is absolutely free will. But free will absolutely works within God's sovereignty. We can't separate those two things. I mean, think about what Joseph just said here. You sold me to Egypt, and God brought me here. Two events that we would look at and say, well, how does this, either the brothers did this freely or God did this, but not both. But it is absolutely both. In Exodus, it says that God raised Pharaoh up, and God hardened Pharaoh's heart, and Pharaoh freely chose to not let the Israelites go. But this was done so that God's power over the Egyptians' gods could be seen, and God would be glorified, and Egypt was punished. How these things work together, we will never understand this side of eternity, if ever. Paul wrote in Ephesians 6:12, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places." Yeah, we live in the world of flesh and blood. Yes, we struggle against flesh and blood, and yet we are at war. We wrestle with the spiritual world. How do these things work together? We do not and we cannot understand. Just know that they are true. God is sovereign over all things. See, this is important because this is the reason Joseph could forgive his brothers. Joseph understood that it was God's plan that Joseph was in Egypt. But it wasn't just that Joseph could forgive his brothers, it's that his brothers could forgive themselves. When we understand God's sovereignty, when we understand that He is in control of all things, we're able to look past the wrongs that were done to us, not because they're not wrong, not because they're not painful, not because they don't leave scars, but because we understand God uses all things together for good for those who love God and are called according to His purpose. One commentator said, "There is not much ground for recriminations when our offenses are placed in the rising tides of God's gracious purposes." How can we forgive? Because we understand that God is in control. Yes, harm is done. Yes, bad things happen. But God is sovereign over them, and somehow He is glorified, and somehow, and for some reason, He chooses to have those things happen. This doesn't mean the brothers didn't sin. They did, and Joseph called them out. You sold me into slavery. This is a wrong that you did. God's sovereignty does not negate the choices we make, but it does give us the ability to forgive. We know God works all things together for His purpose, His glory, and our good. God is sovereign over all of creation. I love how R.C. Sproul put it. He said, "There is not a rogue molecule in the universe. Because if God isn't in control of something, then God isn't God." And yet, people make free decisions. We could talk about this all day long, and we will still not have an answer. So we're going to move to verse 9. "Hurry and go up to my father and say to him, 'Thus says your son Joseph, God has made me Lord of all of Egypt. Come down to me, do not tarry.'" Joseph told his brothers, "Hurry up, go to Canaan, Go home and get Dad. His first concern was for Jacob, then his family. Bring him back to Egypt, and I, Joseph, will take care of all of you. Again, this is a theme that we see throughout the rest of Genesis. Joseph was sent ahead by God to preserve the family and to provide for them. Now, the location of Goshen is not known. There's been different places called Goshen throughout history. The presumption is that this is the eastern Nile Delta, where the Nile runs in to the Mediterranean and it branches out, and this is the perfect spot to be shepherds. Great land for having herds and cattle. But it's interesting, isn't it? Because why did they have to come to Egypt? Why couldn't God have done this anywhere? There's a couple of reasons for this. Remember, before we started focusing on Joseph, we had that chapter of Judah. The family started to be influenced greatly by Canaan. They started branching out. They started leaving home and being influenced by the Canaanites. They all started drifting their own way, doing what they wanted to do. They lost sight of the covenant. But in Egypt, they would all be together. And because they were looked down upon in Egypt, they would be stuck together. They would be isolated. And they would be able to be together and not be influenced from the outside. And they could focus on being the covenantal family. And in that moment, they would become a nation because they were together and they couldn't leave. And so God brought them to Egypt. Egypt was almost an incubator for the nation of Israel. The journey to save them, the journey to Egypt was to save them, but it was also the place where the nation was formed. But more than that, remember Genesis 15:13? God told Abram, he said, "Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and they will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years." The journey to Egypt allowed them to stay together and become a nation, and it was also the beginning of the fulfillment of this promise to Abraham. God works in all things for his purpose, to accomplish what he said he would do. And it was only after Joseph told his brothers who he was and then said, "Go home, hurry up, get Dad, and come back." It was only after this that he focused on his brothers who were present. He fell on Benjamin's neck and wept, and Benjamin wept on his neck. They embraced each other. Joseph kissed all his brothers and wept upon them. It was an amazing reunion, but there's a very easily overlooked passage at the end of verse 15. After that, his brothers talked with him. His brothers talked with him. Isn't it interesting? Remember chapter 37, verse 4. His brothers hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. His brothers couldn't even have a conversation with him without hating him. And here, after all this, they have a conversation. They talk, something that they were previously unable to do. Verse 16, Pharaoh was told that Joseph's brothers came to Egypt. Pharaoh had a message for his brothers through Joseph. When the report was heard in Pharaoh's house, "Joseph's brothers have come," it pleased Pharaoh and his servants. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Say to your brothers, do this. Load your beasts and go back to the land of Canaan. Take your father and your households and come to me. And I will give you the best of the land of Egypt, and you shall eat the fat of the land." You shall eat the fat of the land. They're in famine. What a great promise that would become. Pharaoh had a message. In Hebrew, Pharaoh's words give a sense of urgency. Do this quickly. But there's even more than that. Not only did Joseph promise to help his brothers, but so did Pharaoh. If there's any doubt that Joseph had the ability to do this, Pharaoh now said, I will take care of you too. This shows the influence. This shows the influence that Joseph had, the reputation that he had developed. Think about this. In spite of all that he had been through, in spite of being in a land that he should never have been in, Joseph had authority because he was well respected, because he was honest, he did his work well, and he treated others well. He was faithful. You've probably heard, be faithful or bloom where you're planted. Be faithful in whatever God has given you. That was Joseph, and his reputation was good because of it. In verse 19, and you, Joseph, are commanded to say. This was not a suggestion. This was a royal edict, a command of Pharaoh. Joseph, you have to do this. Joseph gave them wagons. That was not cheap. I mean, think about, in our culture, that would be like the presidential motorcade coming to pick you up. Like, it's royalty. It is traveling well. There's a sense of awe that people see when it goes by. There's the Egyptians. They are powerful. They are royal. This was not a journey that was trudging back to Egypt. This was going in style. And if that's not enough, Joseph gave them new clothes, and then Benjamin 5 pairs of clothes. Don't miss the irony, right? These are high-quality Egyptian clothes. These are nice robes. When was the last time his brothers saw him in a nice robe? It caused them to hate him even more. They had torn their clothes when the cup was found in Benjamin's bag. And so they had torn, ratty clothes, and now Joseph dresses them in beautiful Egyptian robes. He also gave Benjamin 300 shekels of silver. I don't know why that's in there, other than it's another way that Benjamin was favored. 300 shekels of silver was a bit over 7 pounds. So it's not like it weighed them down on their journey, but it was a huge gift that Benjamin was given. 10 donkeys loaded with things from Egypt, 10 female donkeys loaded with grain, bread, and provisions. Joseph took care of them. But these things would also be evidence to Jacob of the events that have taken place. Before they left, Joseph gave one more command in verse 24. Do not quarrel on the way. Don't fight. Joseph knew that the revelation that he just made would cause distress and dissension among the brothers. It would cause them division. Yes, Joseph was alive, and that was amazing, but that being alive and being amazing also had a lot of difficulties behind it. They still needed to learn to trust Joseph, and that would take a long time. They were still in a possibly precarious position. He had the power to enact revenge, and they were powerless. And so he just says, don't fight. Don't fight. You're okay. He wanted them to find the peace that he had found. His brothers did a despicable thing, but it was God who brought him to Egypt, and they needed to find peace. Don't fight. And so the brothers and caravan returned to Jacob. We aren't told of the conversations that they had on the way home. The last time they left Joseph somewhere, they had to figure out on the way home how they were going to lie to their dad, what they did to him. This time they had to tell Jacob that Joseph was alive. Not only alive, but he was second in command in Egypt. He was the second most powerful person in the world. Too many questions for Jacob to believe this. And he apparently had a difficult time trusting and believing his sons. And so they told him Joseph is alive, and he didn't believe them. And so they told him all that Joseph had said. And then he saw all that Joseph gave them. And he said, "It is enough. I'm convinced." Jacob believed, and he immediately wanted to leave and go see Joseph. He would finally be reunited with his long-lost son. I think what's interesting is we are never told whether Joseph's brothers told Jacob what they did. I would love to see that. I would love to see how Jacob... Can you imagine, Dad, Joseph's alive. How was he alive? I thought he was eaten by an animal. We sold him into slavery. We don't know, what happened. We don't know. That conversation never is told to us because the focus is on the reunification of the family. Joseph's rise to power, God's sovereignty, the reconciliation, saving the covenant family. That's the focus. The focus is not on those details. And before we close, I want to spend a moment talking about forgiveness and reconciliation. Because there's this idea floating around that it's possible to forgive. It's possible to forgive without being reconciled. But no, that is not a biblical understanding of forgiveness. We are to forgive as God forgives. And thankfully, that always involves reconciliation. It always involves a restored relationship. As Christians, we are to forgive when somebody who sins against us repents. Forgiveness is not something that happens only internally within ourselves. There will be external evidence, a reconciled relationship. Now, know that this doesn't mean there are no consequences. There are certain situations in which two people should never be in a room together or alone again. We can all think of what those might look like. Reconciling a relationship does not mean putting yourself in a position to be continually victimized. But reconciliation does mean that the relationship is restored to the point where it would surprise the world to see it. There's many. Think of the story that Scott just shared of Corrie ten Boom. A reconciled relationship. It's there. We are together. Thankfully, God does not forgive our sins and then not reconcile us to himself. That would not be helpful. Biblical forgiveness is not just removing guilt. It's also about restoring relationships, and this is hard. It is not for the faint of heart. It's not easy to hear, but it is biblical. It's what God did for us. When Jesus came to earth, he lived the perfect life. He was crucified. He faced the wrath of his Father, and he died on the cross. And he did this not just so that we could be forgiven and remain separated from him. He did this so that we could be forgiven and be in a restored relationship with him forever. No